Welcome, everybody, to our final session of Science Fiction Writers Week. I'm just going to give everyone a few seconds to pop in. The chat should be working, so just to make sure that everything on my end is working, if you can see and hear me, pop your name into the chat. Hi, Casey. So good to see you again, the very last time for this week. Hello, everyone. Hi. Hi, Jeff. Good to see you. Hello. Great. Looks like everything is working. All right. Hey, Megan. Hey, David. Great. It seems like everything is working, so we can go ahead and get started. So just a couple quick bits of housekeeping before we get started. As always, please go ahead and drop your questions into the chat for our Q&A later at the end of this session. Gabriella and I, since this is our last session, do have some time to stay around and answer some of the questions that come in. So please go to the Q&A and make sure that you drop your questions into that chat, or excuse me, into the Q&A rather than the chat, so that we can keep track of those towards the end. And then we will just go ahead and get started. So hi, everybody. My name is Haley. I am here from ProWritingAid for the final session of Science Fiction Writers Week. And I am so thrilled to welcome Gabriella Pereira. Gabriella is an author, speaker, and self-proclaimed word nerd who wants to challenge the status quo of higher education. As the founder and instigator of DIYMFA.com, her mission is to empower writers, artists, and other creatives to apply an entrepreneurial mindset to their education and professional growth. Gabriella earned her MFA in creative writing from the New School and teaches at national conferences, regional workshops, and online. She's also the host of the podcast DIY MFA Radio and the author of the book DIY MFA, Write with Focus, Read with Purpose, and Build Your Community. Hello, Gabriella. Welcome. We are so glad to have you here.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here. So excited to see everyone in the chat, see some new names and also some familiar names. So yay, super excited to be here. Shall I jump on in and get things rolling?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's get this party started, folks. So we are going to be talking about screencraft. I keep saying screencraft every time I present this. Scenecraft. I think it's people have been saying that I must secretly want to be a screenwriter or something. So scenecraft, which is basically the craft that happens at the scene level of your story. And this is the area where world building becomes really important. And of course, world building is super important in sci-fi, hence the connection with this presentation at Sci-Fi Week. So let's dig in. Today, you're going to understand what a scene really is and how it works in your story. You're going to discover the 3 components that are part of every scene, and you're going to learn how to maximize their impact. And I'm going to introduce a new ecological systems approach to world building. This is an approach that's based on developmental psychology, and there's a ton of research behind it in the psychology field, and I have now adapted it to serve as a tool for world building. And we're going to look at how this particular tool operates not just in a book-wide ecosystem, but in a scene level ecosystem. So if you've got questions, as Haley mentioned, drop those in the Q&A tab. Please don't drop them in the chat. I am not good at juggling questions and presenting at the same time. I wish I were that talented. I am not. So the way that I will be able to answer all the questions that need answering is if they go into the Q&A, and then Haley and I will talk about them and jam at the end and answer all those questions. Also, we've got some goodies for you. So please go over to DIYMFA.com/PWA-sci-fi and sign up with your name and email address. And we're going to send you out the copy of the slides. I think I might get a recording of this that I'll be able to send out as well. And then also we've got some, if we have any additional goodies and like fun stuff that we want to share with you, we will send you those as well. So let's dive in. Please tell me in the chat, what is a scene? And while you all are thinking about what a scene is, Haley, would you mind dropping the link into the chat, please? So what is a scene? We've got action and reaction. A snippet of action, reaction, dialogue, etc. Small arc of focused conflict between something that happens to your main character. All right, we got the link in the chat now. So if you guys want that link, it is in the chat. You can click it there. Series of events that impact your characters. It is one scene that occurs and contains one bit of information without changing or shifting perspective. These are all great answers. So here's my definition of a scene. I think of scenes as beads on the necklace that is your story. So each bead is a completed thing. It is not a half bead or a half scene. It is a thing, a unit that has a beginning and an end to it. But a bead does not make an entire necklace. You need to have multiple necklaces in order to have a story. So you could have a story, by the way, like a short story that is a single scene, and that could totally work. But in most cases, in a novel or in a longer piece of writing, you're going to have multiple scenes strung together in order to create a story. So let's take a look more specifically at what a scene is beyond the metaphor of the bead on a string. Essentially, a scene is the smallest common denominator, the smallest storytelling unit that you have in a larger story. Anything smaller than a scene isn't really a complete entity. It'll feel partial in some way, it'll feel incomplete. So you could have a paragraph, but unless that paragraph has the three components that I'm going to introduce in a moment, you don't really have a full scene there. You don't have a completed unit in your story. You just have parts of it. It's a building block for your story. So it is one of many things that then become your entire story. So the atomic level of story, that is a great analogy. And yes, an atomic level in the sense that like an atom is a complete entity, and you could have something like helium that is only helium atoms, but then you could also combine them to make other things, other compounds. It serves a purpose. So if you have a scene in your story, but it's not actually doing anything, then, well, maybe you don't need it in your story. And if you have stuff in your story that isn't this contained unit serving a purpose, moving the story, advancing the story in some way, then maybe it's not really a scene either. So I think of a scene as comprising three particular items. You've got the character arc, you've got the context, and then you've got the time, the passage of time. And in a scene, the shorthand that I often use is the idea of the 5 W's. So usually, this isn't all the time, but in many cases, when you have a scene, you know that you have a scene if you have a who, a character, one or more characters, a what, as in what is happening, when, where, that's the setting, the world, and then a why, that's the purpose of the scene. So if you have all those 5 things going on in a particular moment of your story, then chances are you have a scene. When one of those 5 things changes, so when the characters move to a new location, or when the time shifts to later that day, or when a new action or sequence of action starts to happen, when a new character comes in on the scene, that usually is an indication, not always, but usually a good rule of thumb is that that is a sign that there is a new scene. If you think of theater, oftentimes this is exactly how scenes are broken down. A character exits, we're now in a new scene. Character enters, we're in a new scene. We move to a different setting, a new backdrop, it's a new scene, etc. So that's our main model for scene craft. Now let's talk about ecological systems theory. Ecological systems theory was developed by Urie Bronfenbrenner, a professor at Cornell University, who I had the pleasure of meeting when I was studying psychology at Cornell many years ago. And his theory, back when I think it was like in the late 1970s, he came up with this theory where development of a human was not just about nature versus nurture. Up until like the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of debate about like, is it inherent to the person's personality, their inherent nature, or are people doing things because it's their environment that's influencing them? And what Bronfenbrenner came up with was this idea that the two things are very closely intertwined. In fact, he developed this ecological systems theory where you have the person at the center, and then you have these ripples, which are layers of influence. And all of these layers influence the layers within and the layers without. And they also all have interactions between the different layers as well. So if the person, the child, is at the center, that would be number one. Then things like the person's family, that might be layer 2, will have an impact on the person. Things like what's happening to the person's relationships between their family members might be layer 3. What's happening in their neighborhood or their community, that would be layer 4. The systems, the structures of the world, like what's happening politically. Do they have a new school board influence going on? All of these things can be impacting how the kid at the center of this ecosystem is going to behave. And eventually the Chronos system, this is the farthest system out, the time was the passage of time. And this is the system that's about basically Bronfenbrenner realized the Chronos system was the part that he added last. And he realized that all of the layers inside of the Chronos system also change over time. So if you think about what the world was like in the 1970s and then the 1980s and 1990s, there was a lot of change and shift because of technology, because of, just developments in the world and how the world was. So all of these things are going to impact the layers within it, including the child at the center. So the two things, the SceneCraft model with the character, context, and time, and the ecosystem model come together. But let's take a closer look at the ecosystems first. At the center, you've got the character. So this is what Bronfenbrenner called the microsystem. This will be the child at the center. In the case of your world building, it's your character, your main character, protagonist. Now, some people might say, but what if you've got more than one character? What if you've got 2 protagonists or 3 protagonists? Well, pick one. In a given moment, one of the protagonists will be the more important one, and that's the one who's at the center of the ecosystem for that part of the story. This is going to be the part where the character's internal state, all the things that your character brings to the table, how they interact the world, how they see the world, that is going to impact everything that happens around them. So the way they see the world is going to affect the point of view of that character. Yes, point of view is going to affect how that character behaves. If the character just met the love of their life, they're going to have a very different outlook than if they think they're being chased by bad guys. So the way the character feels in that moment and the things that have just happened to the character or have happened in the character's backstory and his baggage they've been carrying for decades, all of those things are internal to the character and are part of the character's piece in the ecosystem. So this is going to shape their thoughts, their opinions, and their thoughts and opinions are going to shape how they view the world around them. The next layer out, what Bronfenbrenner called the, oh no, that wasn't the microsystem. That was the individual, was the one at the center. This is the microsystem. This is the supporting cast. So in the case of Bronfenbrenner's model, the microsystem is all of the immediate influences around the child. So this is, the child's family, their primary caregivers, their, like their teacher at school, siblings, people who are the most important people in the child's life. And if any of you have small children at home, you know that especially with really young children, the important people in their lives, they're not that many. It's usually the parents, the caregiver, or caregivers, maybe some grandparents, maybe siblings play a big role, and then maybe like the one important teacher at school, and that's about it. It's only when kids are older that there are other people in that immediate circle, like their friends at school and their social networks and whatnot. So With the supporting cast, you've got these characters who are going to influence the character, the protagonist in that moment. These are the characters who are part of the protagonist's world. They're also important people in that protagonist's life. So you need to ask yourself, who are the people in their lives who make a difference, make an impact? Who are the people they care about? Who are the people they really dislike? And how do they impact the person's life and what they bring to the table? How do they impact the way the character sees the world? So ask yourself, who do they care about? And also, who do they detest? And what's the impact on that character? So next, you need to think about the relationships. The third layer out is what Bronfenbrenner calls the mesosystem. The mesosystem is the system of systems. So it's the system between the different influences within the microsystem. So for example, you have, let's suppose you've got a child at the center and you've got parents, and the parents are getting divorced. That relationship between the two parents is now going to have a very big impact on the kid, even though the kid may not be involved, even if the parents are trying very hard not to get the kid stuck in the middle of the, whatever discussions or arguments or whatnot. The child is still going to feel that ripple effect from the dynamics between the parents. Similarly, if you have a child at the center, you might have a positive event or something that the parents might think of as a positive event, like say the birth of a new child, who the parents might be super excited, but maybe for the kid, it's, that dynamic of they're not the only kid in the house anymore, and that sort of imbalance of the child dynamic, not being the only child or what have you, or imbalance between siblings, having a new sibling in the mix, can also be something that shakes up the dynamic and creates tension in the mesosystem. So you need to think about the relationships, not just between the character and the supporting cast, but also between the different people in the supporting cast. And these relationships could influence your main character. They can also become part of shaping the world of your main character. So ask yourself, does your character feel like the odd person out? A really great way, by the way, to shake up a scene is to make it so that there's an odd number of characters in the scene. So if you ever find that a scene is falling flat or not quite landing or working for you, my advice is always to count the number of characters, important characters, not just walk-ons, but important characters in the scene. And then if it's an even number, make it an odd number. Because chances are, when you make it an odd number, you're going to have that imbalance of power. And that's going to suddenly spice things up and give your scene new life and a little bit more energy. And then also ask yourself, are there characters that are at each other's throats? Think of the Harry, Ron, Hermione triad in the Harry Potter books, that at any given moment, two of the three of them are always fighting. And then the third one is always stuck in the middle, trying to make peace between the two who are always fighting. And it's very rare for the three of them to all be getting along at the same time throughout the series. That creates tension, it creates drama, because you've got this triad and you've got the odd person out dynamic, and you've got the character who's stuck in the middle of the two characters who are at each other's throats. Speaking of characters in the world, Office Cat would like to be part of this discussion. All right, moving on to the surroundings. The surroundings are the immediate the immediate environment around your character. In Bronfenbrenner's model, he called this the exosystem, and it was the part that's like the village that takes care of raises the child. This is the village, it's the community, it's the neighborhood, it's the child's school, it's the child's, if the child goes to church or has a synagogue or has a, community that they are a part of, that is the immediate community, is the exosystem. So ask yourself, what is in your character's immediate surroundings? And not even in like the immediate communities, but like what's in the room where the character is, the room where it happens, as it were. What are they thinking and feeling, and how is this room influencing what they think, feel, and behave? Like how is the space immediately around them influencing them. And think about sensory descriptions here. This is where the five senses come in, where you've got, what is the character seeing and hearing? We often tend to lean very heavily as writers on sight and sound, and yet touch, taste, and smell are also incredibly important and can be powerful tools for creating that ambiance, that immediate surrounding area. And the key here is to help your reader feel like they're there with your character in that space. The fifth layer out is the macro system in Bronfenbrenner's lingo. And this is what I call the world systems and structure. So most writers tend to jump straight to this part of world building. Don't get me wrong, I love me a good map of a world. I love figuring out caste systems and the dynamics between the political landscape of the world and how everything is working in the world. But if you haven't grounded the world around a character and around the sort of smaller parts of the world, the smaller rings in the world, then no amount of really awesome land building and geography and caste systems and social structures can make up for the lack of characters, heart, and soul in the world. So while it's great to do this part, I always caution writers not to jump here first, because you'll end up, it's easy to get sucked in. And by the way, easy to go down the rabbit holes of mapping out your world and doing all that fun. I mean, this is the fun part of world building, but it's also dangerous. So make sure that you've got the character, you've done that work with your character so that you really understand who the person is, so that we know who we care about, who we root for within this world before you start worrying about the different, species of dragons and whatnot. So remember that without compelling characters at the center, all this complex world building and all these systems aren't going to mean anything to your reader. Your reader cares about them because they're important to your character. Your reader doesn't care about them just because they're cool. I mean, they are cool, but your reader's going to care about them because it has an impact on how your character behaves and is and lives. And yes, Casey, I've had to tell Casey to stop doing that and start writing, because it is so easy. I'm right there with you guys. If you've ever been in the scenario where you want to do the world building, I am there with you. I feel you, because I love doing this stuff too, but it's really dangerous. You could go down this rabbit hole and never actually write the book. And the book is the part that really matters. So remember that the places where the systems get interesting is when your character is butting up against some part of the system. So for example, in the Hunger Games, yes, we've got all these different districts and whatnot, but they don't really mean a whole lot until Katniss is stuck in the games and having to deal with the career tributes from districts 1 and 2. And she meets Rue from district 11, and she meets Foxface from district 5. That's like all the computery stuff. So it's really only important, the districts only start to have meaning and to take on a certain level of depth and interest for us as readers when Katniss is facing the people from the districts and interacting with humans from those districts. Finally, we've got the timeline. So as I mentioned, the chrono system, which is the timeline piece, really only came into play quite a while after Bronfenbrenner had already been putting this theory out there and testing it and whatnot. And this is where he realized that a lot of the interactions that were happening in the macro system and within were all changing over time. The whole model itself was dynamic. And over time, the model would shift and change. And that's because, well, when time passes, people in the world change. So the same thing is true in your story. As your story develops, as the timeline of the story moves and the story itself, the plot events occur, the dynamics within your world building ecosystem are also going to change. So remember that scenes, this brings us back to the whole scene craft piece, they occur in a sequence and they occur for a reason. they're not just random things that are happening. They happen because characters are making decisions, and then those decisions cause other things to happen or cause them to be in places where things are happening. And then they make other decisions, and so on and so forth. Characters are going to be affected by events, and the scenes that they're in, whatever scene you're in, is affected by the events that come before it. But then they're also going to have an impact on the events that come after. And remember that the timeline piece can also include backstory. In fact, backstory is where the timeline piece links us back into the center of the circle, because the backstory is a character thing that the character is bringing into the scene with them. But it's also a timeline thing, because the character is now a different person than they were when the backstory stuff happened. And the backstory has also influenced how they've developed into the person they are right now. So I almost think of it as like this sort of Mobius circle, concentric circle that then like shoots back in on itself from the outside in, and where you're looping from the sixth ring out back into the center, and sort of round and round we go. All right, so now let's go back to our scene craft model and talk about how these two models come together. We've got the ecological systems thing, and now we've got the scene craft and the three dynamic elements that are happening within each and every scene. How do these two things fit together? So we're going to start by looking at the character piece. This is what I call the character arc piece. That's why it's a little arch, because it's the part of the scene where the character is actually acting in the scene. It's the stuff that the character is either doing, thinking, feeling, how they're appearing, and what they're saying in a given scene. And by character, I mean the main character, but it can also be the supporting cast, and it also includes the relationship between the main character and the supporting cast within themselves. So really what it boils down to is actions and interactions. So the character component, you want to remember that the characters are going to have internal responses, i.e. thoughts, feelings, as the scene unfolds. There's also going to be some sort of external component. The character may or may not respond externally. For instance, they may say something or do something, or they may show something in their demeanor, their appearance, their body language. And other characters are also going to have internal responses, thoughts, and emotions, but they're also going to have possibly external behaviors, dialogue, and appearance, demeanor. And the relationship between the main character, the supporting characters, and the supporting characters with each other are also going to impact how the main character behaves in that moment in the scene. So you want to ask yourself, when you're thinking about the internal state of your main character, this is the layer one piece that's happening in a given scene. These are going to be the thoughts and emotions. So ask yourself, stay grounded in the present moment and ask yourself, what's the character thinking? What's the character feeling? And what's the character doing in this scene? When it comes to the other characters in the scene, the supporting cast, you also want to stay grounded in the moment and ask yourself, who else is in the scene? And what purpose are these characters serving in this specific scene? And what are their motivations? How do they relate? How do these motivations of the supporting cast relate to the main character's goals and motivations? And you want to think about what the outcome of the scene is for the main character and also for the supporting characters. Every character goes into a scene or an interaction, they generally have something that they want to get out of it. Whether they are 100% sure they know what they want to get out of it, or they just have this vague feeling, like they just kind of have a sense of the direction of what they want to achieve. But most of the time, people have something, there's like a direction in which the scene is moving, right? They have some motivation in that scene. And so you need to ask yourself, what are the outcomes that the supporting characters want in this given interaction? And what's the outcome that the main character wants in this interaction? And are these things working together in concert, or are these motivations up against each other? Hint, the up against each other motivations are a lot more interesting. When the main character wants something and a supporting character wants the exact opposite, or something that is the antithesis of what the main character wants, that's where things can get interesting. And yes, by the way, if you're wondering, because I'm moving super fast, like, are you going to get the slides? You will absolutely get the slides. Sign up with your email address at that link that I gave at the beginning. And if Haley wouldn't mind dropping the link in the chat again, just in case people missed it or they don't have to go digging back through it. Awesome sauce. Thank you. So yeah, so outcomes. You want to make sure that, like, if you've got the motivations, keep it interesting and have the characters have motivations that are at odds with each other to keep things moving forward and add some conflict. So social dynamics. This is the third layer. So this is the relationships between the characters and how these relationships are going to be impacting and playing out in a given scene. So think about the relationships between your characters and ask yourself, how do these relationships impact the action in the scene? If a character gets along with another character, the scene is going to play out differently if they're working together, let's say, than if they don't get along, if they are at each other's throats, if they're trying to undermine each other. If they're trying to undermine each other and yet they are pretending to get along, that's interesting too. And ask yourself, how did the supporting character relationships affect your protagonist? So remember, just because the protagonist isn't part of the relationship in question doesn't mean the protagonist doesn't feel a ripple effect from that relationship. If you've got two other characters who are at each other's throats and your main character is trying to accomplish something in a given scene, that fight between the other characters could totally derail whatever hope the main character has of achieving what they want in that scene. All right, so we talked about the character arc. That's the inner three rings that usually come into play. Now we've got the context arc. And the context is the stuff that comes into the scene with the characters and with the world, and then continues and is carried on into the next scene. So it's all of the sort of backgroundy kind of stuff. It's not the active part of the characters, but it's their baggage that they're bringing with them. So internal and external context. Essentially, the context is the stuff that impacts your scene. Characters are going to bring internal factors, their personalities, their emotions, their experiences into the scene with them. They're also going to bring external factors, like the micro level external factors, like this immediate surroundings. And they're also going to be macro level internal factors, which are the systems of the world, right? So like whatever the immediate surroundings are, that's going to create context in your given scene. And that's micro level context. And then you have macro level context, which is like the big overarching systems of the world. We might not see the different factions of dragon chasers, but if we know that there are 4 different warring factions of dragon chasers in this world, that may have an impact on what's happening to our particular character as they are in an arena of dragon warriors or something. So let's take a look at the internal context. And while I only highlighted the main character, you can also have supporting characters bringing in context with them. You could have characters who are not the main character, who also have baggage, who also have backstory, and they're bringing it into the scene with them. And that becomes part of the context, the internal context in the scene. So in layer 1, you've got the emotions and the experiences of your main character. You could also have layer 2, which is the emotions and experiences of the supporting cast. So think about the internal stuff that your characters bring to the scene. What's the emotional baggage that your character brings into the scene with them? What experiences have they had in the past that might impact the character in this given scene? remember that what's happened to the character isn't a blank slate every time they walk into a scene. Everything that's happened leading up to this moment is going to impact the scene for this character. By the way, this is a tricky thing. If you're like me and you tend to write stories out of order and you move a scene to a different part of your story, now you've actually moved it's like you've moved dominoes around in the row of dominoes, and there's now going to be either more or fewer events that have impacted your character if you move it to a new place. So that can actually impact the way you write that scene. You may have to rework or rewrite certain scenes if you move them to a different part of the story based on what the character's experiences are up until that point. Now, this doesn't mean it can't be done, but you want to make sure when you do make these shifts in the timeline that you are taking into account the experiences or the removal of experiences that your character is having. All right, so next you've got the external context, and we've got external macro and micro level. This is the micro level context, so the surroundings with your character. So consider the immediate surroundings where your character is in this scene and ask yourself the following. When and where are you? When is the scene taking place? Be really specific. Don't just say at school. It's happening on the second floor hallway next to the character's locker, which happens to be right outside the principal's office. Now, all of a sudden, we've got like a really specific place, and we can start to hear and see it in our mind's eye. We know what it feels like. We know the vibe, like right outside the principal's office. So be specific when you're thinking about the scene. You don't have to give us all that information, but if you have it very crystal clear in your mind, it's going to translate in your scene as you're writing it. And then ask yourself, what does your character, use the 5 senses. What does your character see, hear, touch, taste, and smell? Now, you don't have to go, all right, do I have seeing? Check. Do I have hearing? Check. Do I have touch? Check. I mean, it's not like that. But remember that we as humans do tend to default to either seeing, to sight, or sound, usually. A lot of us tend to default to sight. And some of us, I tend to actually default a lot to sound because I'm a very audio person. So know what you tend to do as sort of the place where you lean on the most with the senses, and push yourself outside your comfort zone so that you can create that really rich sensory experience for your reader. Remember also that you don't need to bombard your reader with all the senses all the time, but what you need is that one or other really interesting detail that then brings the senses to life for the reader in that moment, for that scene in the moment. All right. Next, we've got the external context on a macro level. So the systems of the world. So the structure, systems, etc. So think about the world of your story. Now we're thinking about the fun world building, different caste systems and maps and whatnot, and ask yourself, how do these elements impact your character in this moment? So while it might be super interesting to have the whole world planned out, if it doesn't impact the character in this moment, you don't need to tell the reader about it. You can leave that stuff out right now. Sorry, geriatric kitty needs, she's old and does not like to jump up on the desk, so she meows incessantly until I pick her up. Apologies. So remember that it has to impact the character in that moment. Otherwise, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the story until it's relevant. And ask yourself, how do these elements impact the stakes of your story? How can you use the elements to raise the stakes? So let's use the Hunger Games as an example. We've got all these different districts. They don't become important until Katniss is actually in the games. Up until then, we just knew about District 12. We didn't know about all the other districts of Panem until she ends up going to the capital as one of the tributes. how does it then raise the stakes? Well, suddenly we start finding out that nobody from District 12, there's only been one victor from District 12 in the whole history of the games. And we also start to find out additional context, like, all the other districts, some of them give their tributes a ton of food and money and all of that. They have tons of sponsors and whatnot. District 12 doesn't have that. So they're by far the underdogs. All of a sudden, we start to see that the structure of these districts and the sort of system of the different districts in this world has put Katniss at a distinct disadvantage in terms of her ability to survive the games. And so now it's become relevant, and it's also started to raise the stakes because she realizes now that she's going to have to work twice as hard in order to get what she wants, which is to survive, to go back home to her mom and to her sister. Finally, we have time. And the passage of time is the timeline at the bottom, the straight arrow across, and it corresponds to the outermost ring in the ecosystems theory. So let's take a closer look. This essentially is the plot piece of the model. So remember that scenes are going to need some action. Yes, you can have a character alone in a room, sitting by themselves, not doing anything. But even if they're sitting by themselves, they're probably thinking, or they're probably feeling something. And if they're alone in a room without any action, those thoughts and feelings are going to become incredibly important. So there's always something going on in a scene, even if it's not physical activity, there's always some action, either on an emotional level, physical level, dialogue level, or the appearance and demeanor of the character. There's always going to be some activity happening in the scene. Otherwise, you can't, it's not really a scene because nothing's going on. So as I mentioned, story is like a row of dominoes, and every scene that comes before is going to impact the scene that comes next. And they're going to in turn impact the scenes after that. And that's going to create this effect, this sort of ripple effect throughout your story. So remember that this means that the world of your story is going to shift over time. And it's going to shift over time because your character has changed. The world itself might change over time. So again, a Hunger Games example. In the beginning of the trilogy, we have Katniss showing up in the Capitol, and she's a tribute for the first time ever. She doesn't know anything about how the games work or what have you. She's just sort of bombarded with all of this information at once. In the second book, when the Quarter Quell happens, and suddenly Katniss is by default forced to go back into the games because only people who have been victors in the past are participating in the games or participating in the reaping this time around. She's now experiencing it for the second time, and she's experiencing it with a very different outlook because she's been through it, and she's been through it just the previous year. And so now she's got a very different opinion about things. She's got very different feelings. She's a different person. She also is in the games with Peeta. The two of them have that, love-hate thing going on. So there's all sorts of emotional stuff that's happening in the second time through the games that she's experiencing that didn't happen and that weren't in play the first time she went through the games. So the world of the story, it's still that same world, but the world has changed because Katniss has changed and the rules of the world have now changed as well. So think about the events of your story. That's where this all comes into play. So consider the events and ask yourself, what backstory is relevant here? For example, we don't actually learn the details of the one tribute who had won from District 12 before Katniss and Peeta did, i.e. Haymitch. We don't learn about that story. We don't get all of that context until the second book, until it becomes important and relevant to what Katniss needs to know and what Katniss needs to do in the second book. In the first book, we just know that only one other person has ever won from their district, and that's it. That's all the information we have. We don't have all the detailed backstory. So ask yourself, what does your reader need to know? And What events have already occurred in the story's timeline, and what impact do these events have on where the character is right here and now? And then you also need to ask yourself about off-page events. This is basically what I call the story's negative space. If positive space is a space occupied by the story itself, the negative space is the stuff that happens around the events of the story, the stuff that isn't in the story itself, but rather is the off-page stuff that is implied and that we find out either through hearsay later on, or we find out because it's implied in the actions of the story. So let's recap. With the scene craft model, we've got the three components. We've got the character arc within the scene. We've got the context, which is that Ripley stuff that's kind of creating texture within the scene and giving us context. And then we've got the passage of time within the scene. In the ecological systems theory, we've got this series of ripples, starting with the main character at the center, supporting cast, the relationships between them, then the character's immediate surroundings, structure and systems, and then of course the time and the storyline or plot. So now what? Now that we've talked about this in theory, what do you do with it? Well, here are some next steps you can take. First, I highly recommend writing in scene. So what this means is instead of planning a whole bunch of world building stuff, sit down and put your character in a place in your world and just write what happens. This approach is going to help you for a couple of different reasons, and here's why. First, it's going to allow you to make progress toward your word count. Yay! Progress toward your word count is always a good thing because then you can finish your book. So instead of actually like just brainstorming amorphously, actually write things that could become scenes in the finished product. It also allows you to develop and discover ideas organically. So as you are writing things in scene, you might discover something that then impacts later scenes or that makes you want to rethink and revamp earlier scenes. But it's going to happen organically, and it's going to happen in a way that feels a lot more natural than artificially imposing a system around your story and then shoving your story and forcing it into that system. Plus, it's a lot less likely that you will succumb to shiny object syndrome, which when you're working from the ground up, you're focused here on the scene that's right in front of you. So the idea of, oh, wait, there's a dragon training area over there. Awesome. Like, yes, dragon training is really awesome, but you're not focusing on the scene that's right in front of you anymore. So when you're doing the writing in scene, you're a lot more likely to stay focused and to be able to just set aside the other really cool, shiny, sparkly ideas and instead not be looking at the bird's eye view level, which makes you a lot more likely to want to, ooh, dragons, like that. So when you do need, occasionally you do need to step out and have an overview. Use a couple of specific diagnostic tools depending on what layer you're dealing with. So, as I mentioned, fuzzy brainstorming, like that sort of amorphous brainstorming, can make you feel overwhelmed. It can also lead you to the point where there's so many options and there's so many things you can pre-plan that you end up feeling so overwhelmed by it that you don't do anything at all. So in order to figure out what's in need of the most attention in your writing, in your project, what you can do is pull back and get a bird's eye view, but use specific techniques based on which of the ripples in the concentric circles you need to focus on in that moment. So if you need to deal with character related stuff, so layers 1, 2, or 3, I highly recommend using the character compass, which is a diagnostic tool that you can find in chapter 9 of the DIY MFA book. So if you happen to have that book handy, you can look it up and just use that tool as a way of figuring out what's going on with your character in the scene. The way I use the compass is I don't just try to make the compass like perfectly balanced and beautiful. Instead, I do the compass exercise on a number of different scenes that I've already written, and it shows me what I'm leaning on too much, what part of showing of my character development I'm doing too much of, and what part I'm not doing enough of. So I might notice that my characters are really doing a lot of things, or they might be having a lot of dialogue. Like, I'm great at action and dialogue. I'm terrible at thought. My characters never have a single thought. So I often see that, like, if I do the character compass, I actually see that there's a dip in the part of the compass where the thinking comes into play. So that's one tool that you can use when you're dealing with your characters. When you're dealing with and you can also go through the questions from the slide deck for those 3 layers and ask yourself those questions as well. Those can be sort of like touchstone questions if you don't happen to have the book handy. If you need help with layers 4 and 5, you can also use the exercises and questions from this presentation, or you can lean on chapter 15 of the book, which is the chapter where I talk more about big picture, macro and micro context world building. So immediate surroundings and structural world building. And then if you are in need of work with the plot piece, this is where a tool like scene cards, this is where I use little cards that I have, these little index cards that I fill out, and I put, what's going on in each scene on an index card. If you use Scrivener, you can use Scrivener in the same way, and then you can move the cards around. Pro Writing Aid might even have some tools built into it that might help you with some of this stuff. So if there are tools that can help you either with character compass stuff or with scene card stuff, by all means, also lean on those tools. It's always great to have when technology jumps in and helps you with these things. And try to see if you can locate the major scenes in your story. Where's the inciting incident of your story? Where's the midpoint of your story? Where's the dark night of the soul or the climax of your story? And once you've mapped out where those scenes fall, it's easier to try to fill in the gaps in between. If you're someone who writes more linearly, and you tend to write the story in order, knowing more or less what needs to happen for those important landmarks can give you something to aim for, so that you're not just meandering aimlessly, but you actually have a general direction for when you're writing. And again, there's some chapters in the DIY MFA book that also relate to those topics. So this is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a ton of other information that I can share with you, that I would love to share with you. So please go over to DIYMFA.com/PWA-sci-fi, and the link is also in the chat. And sign up with your email. You'll get the slides shortly, if not immediately, definitely within the next couple of days. And you'll also, if we're able to share the recording, we will share that. And then also any additional goodies. We are always coming up with new systems and new structures and whatnot, models like this that we love to share with folks. And the folks who are, in touch with us via email are always the folks who hear about it first. So with that said, it looks like we have some time for questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple questions here, so we will go ahead and dive in. So Katarina starts by asking, how would the bullseye work for pantsers? So for people who are not planning out their outline.
So if you're not planning, the bullseye isn't an outline tool. It's more like something for you to have in your mind as you're writing. So even if you're a pantser, you might not be thinking about like each and every one of those things and planning out each and every, like I think of pantsers as people who are planning out like the order of their scenes, but I don't necessarily think of pantsers, or not pantsers, plotters, as people who plan out the order of the scenes. But like, I don't necessarily think of plotters as people who are also planning like, okay, what are all the things I need to be thinking about within each and every scene? Like, I know I'm sort of half plotter, half pantser, and I don't necessarily think about all that stuff. So think of it as more like having that model in the back of your mind. And then as you're writing your scene, you don't want to go in there and be like, do I have a main character? Check. Do I have a supporting cast? Check. Like, that's just going to feel mechanical and it's going to feel weird and you're going to squash your voice and it's going to be awful. Instead, you want to think about, like, my advice actually is absorb this presentation, absorb the slides, and then put them away. And trust that, like, the part of your lizard brain that it sort of soaks it up and like takes it in will know what it's doing, and then it'll all like work itself out. But I wouldn't stress too much about, like, this isn't a checklist or a series of, like, dots, things that you cross off the list, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. S. Martin says, not a question, just wanted to tell you that your emails have been insanely helpful and inspiring. So thank you. Okay, and then here's the link for the to sign up for the email list for that insanely helpful and inspiring email list. Okay, so Daryl has a couple questions. The first one is, how does this work where an action changes the future and the subsequent story? The film Sliding Doors is an example of this trope, and this method seems to kind of assume a linear timeline within the narrative.
So, okay, so time is always linear, except it might be presented as not linear, right? Like, so I was just watching Star Trek yesterday. My absolute favorite Star Trek episode of all time is the one in Next Generation where there's like the old Enterprise comes out of the time loop thing and they have like the time just changes. But like, my point here is that it's just because you're seeing the things out of order doesn't mean that the storyline isn't still, like, there's still a passage of time. And even if you're going back in time and you're changing the past and that's changing the future, there's still like a logical progression of how the story is going to evolve. And the thing to remember also is that chronological time and the emotional timeline, the emotional arc of your story is not the same as the chronological arc of your story. So like in the Sliding Doors, or I'm thinking the movie Memento also, where you've got the two intertwining timelines, one of them's moving forward, one of them's moving back, and then the climax is actually the exact middle where the two timelines meet, but it happens at the end of the film in the moment of the climax of the film. So in that case, the like overarching arc, like the emotional arc of the story is not the same as the chronology, but it still follows the rules of like emotional arc of how stories work. Like you have that moment at the end where the story resolves itself in the climax, and you've got like the buildup of the, each of the scenes building up one after another. And it's the interaction between the two timelines that gives us the context so that we can see what it means when one of the timelines is like out of sync with the other. So like the intertwininess is actually part of what allows us to realize like, oh wait, there's something weird going on here. There's something kind of messed up with the timeline.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Daryl also asks, how much do we need to assume the reader has assimilated from previous scenes that develop the internal and external contexts?
So I always like to err on the side of trusting the reader is very, very smart. So I don't think you need to over-explain things to the reader. So trust that your reader has figured it out and has assimilated the right amount of information. I tend to think that less is more. Like oftentimes the place where world building can feel clunky is when we over-explain things. Like I very rarely had people say, Gabriella, I really needed you to tell me more about this magic system. Like usually it's like, enough already. I don't need to understand how the magic works. And you just sort of accept the way the world of the story is. So I think, and the other thing to remember too, is that if your character is well versed in the rules of your world, they don't need to know this information. So you don't need to tell your reader this information because it will feel artificial. Like, especially if you're in a first person point of view, because it's not like Katniss Everdeen is telling herself, well, this is how the 12 districts of Panem work, because she knows how they work, because she lives there and she grew up there. So, remember also that depending on how the reader is receiving the story, if they're receiving it through the point of view, either a close third person or a first person point of view, there you kind of have to take certain things for granted and assume that the reader gets it, because the character wouldn't be thinking about those things. The character would already know all of that information.
Yeah. Okay, Andrew says, I struggle with knowing what to aim for in terms of the number of scenes per chapter. Do you have any advice for that?
Oh gosh, there's no hard and fast rule. There are so many different ways to do it. I'll give you an example of a book that has a single scene that spans basically half the book. And so there's this beautiful book called Sweethearts by Sarah Zarr. It's YA, it's contemporary YA, and it's got two timeline things going on. So you've got the present day timeline, and I believe it's told in past tense. And it's kind of like over a span of several weeks in the present day. Stuff is happening with this kid and she's a teenager and whatnot. But then there's the past tense, the past timeline, which is told in present tense, where there was a single event that happened that was very traumatic for that character and her best friend. And it is literally that entire event stretched out over the series of like every other chapter, basically, for the entire book. So like half the book is a single scene. And it's, we have a chapter where it is just a piece of that scene. And then right when it's about to give us something new, like that we're at a cliffhanger, now we're back in present day and we're seeing some more. And then we go back and we see more. And then we get to a cliffhanger, and like it keeps tugging you through because you want to see like what exactly, we know something bad happened. We just don't know what it is until we get to the end of that sequence. So we get to the climax. Again, the emotional arc, we get to the climax where the two timelines basically come together and like we find out what really happened in the past. And then also there's like the reckoning with what really happened in the present timeline. So that's an example of like, you can have a single scene that literally spans multiple chapters. You could also have a chapter that has like 30 scenes in it, and you're like zipping from one thing to another. And this is where pacing comes in, right? Like if you want to move your story forward really quickly, zipping from one scene to another within a chapter and packing lots of scenes into a single chapter can make the chapter feel like it's moving really fast. You can also create a sense of suspense by dragging and stretching a scene out for a really long time, like over the course of multiple chapters, or even just like when you slow down the passage of time, like, in those romance movies where they're about to kiss and it's like, they're almost, and it's just like, you're like, enough already, come on. So but like, it's the slowing down that actually builds the suspense. And you're like, will they, won't they? Same thing with like, when you have an action movie and it slows down to slow motion, just as they're like, doing that.
It's a tool, like you said, it's a tool for creating suspense and creating pacing. And I think there's a lot of places you can put chapter breaks or take away chapter breaks, and it becomes this additional layer of formatting that tricks the eye and tricks how you're thinking about something. I always think about the scene in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire where Harry's name is called at the end of a chapter, because it's like this cliffhanger, but then it's picking up exactly in the same place. It's just that cliffhanger is there for the purposes of like, again, creating that break in the reader's mind. Exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
And I also, when I write, and this is just me, a quirk of my own writing, is I don't write in chapters. I write scenes. And then I figure out later whether these scenes are going to fit together in a chapter or not. And you can also play with like chapter length, right? Like if you have chapters that get shorter and shorter and shorter, that's going to make it feel like the book is moving faster. as you know, so you can play with that. If you're like gearing up to the, exciting climax, you could shorten your chapters to move things or have it be a scene per chapter for a bit so that it moves things faster. And like you said, it's a tool. It's more like a formatting tool than it is really a like artistry kind of thing per se.
Yeah, exactly. What was the book that you were just recommending that has the scene that stretches over multiple
Sweethearts by Sarah Zarr.
Sweethearts by Sarah Zarr. Awesome. Someone was asking in the chat. Well, those are all of the questions that we had. Gabriella, thank you so much for joining us. This was so fascinating. And I know a lot of people are going to return to this presentation again and again. I've just pasted the link in the chat as well so that you can get the slides from Gabriella. We will put the replay of this up on the hub and then also send it to Gabriella as well. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you all for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure. I've had a blast.
Yeah, and thank you all so much for coming to Science Fiction Writers Week this week. I'll have all of the replays up on the hub as soon as they process tonight. And yeah, check out the hub and see all the stuff over the next week. Thank you all so much. Bye. Have a great night.